Some men are born broken. Others have their hearts torn from their chest on a rain-soaked October night 30 years ago and never quite learn how to breathe again. Micah Canant stood in the darkness of his penthouse office, the yellowed divorce papers clutched in his trembling hands like a death sentence that had never been served. The storm outside Manhattan's financial district seemed to echo the tempest that had been raging in his soul for 3 decades, violent, unforgiving, and utterly without mercy. At 50, he was worth more money than most small countries. He was a man who could topple governments with a phone call and destroy lives with a signature. The financial world called him ruthless, and they weren't wrong. He had built his empire on the frozen wasteland of his heart, each billion earned through the calculated destruction of anything that dared to threaten his carefully constructed walls. But tonight, like every October 15th for the past 30 years, he wasn't the feared billionaire who made grown men weep in boardrooms. He was just a 20-year-old boy again, holding the pieces of a love that had been his entire universe before it exploded into nothing. The papers bore the elegant signature of Serafina Valdez, a name that still made his chest tighten with a pain so sharp it felt like dying. Even now he could remember everything about her with painful clarity. The way her laugh had sounded like music, how her dark eyes had promised him forever, the silk of her raven hair when she whispered that she would love him until the stars fell from the sky. They had met during his senior year at Columbia, when his father's construction company was still thriving, and the Canant name meant something in New York society. Serafina had been the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, a goddess wrapped in Valentino and dreams, and somehow, impossibly, she had chosen him. For 2 years, they had been inseparable, their love the kind of passionate, all-consuming fire that poets wrote about and mortals died for. He had proposed on a beach in the Hamptons, going down on one knee in the sand as the sunset painted the sky in shades of promise. She had said yes with tears streaming down her perfect face, and for one shining moment, Micah had believed that he was the luckiest man alive. The wedding was planned for the spring, a lavish affair that would have rivaled a royal celebration. Serafina threw herself into the preparations with the enthusiasm of a woman who had found her fairy tale, and Micah would have given her anything she desired. He was drunk on love, dizzy with the certainty that he had found his soulmate, the woman who would bear his children and grow old beside him. But fairy tales, as Micah learned in the cruelest way possible, were just stories told to children who didn't yet understand that the world was a place designed to break your heart. The first crack in his perfect world came when his father's company began to struggle. A series of bad investments, a housing market downturn, and some unscrupulous partners had left Canant Construction bleeding money. What had once been a thriving business worth millions was suddenly drowning in debt, and bankruptcy loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon. Micah had been confident that love would conquer all, that Serafina would stand by him as they weathered the storm together. He had been young enough to believe that their love was stronger than money, deeper than social status, more eternal than the comfortable life she had always known. He had been a fool. The change in Serafina was subtle at first, a coolness in her touch, a distance in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. She began cancelling dates, claiming headaches or prior commitments. Their conversations, once filled with laughter and dreams of the future, became stilted and awkward. When he tried to discuss the wedding plans, she would change the subject with a brightness that felt forced, but Micah, blinded by love and desperate to believe that their bond was unbreakable, convinced himself that she was just stressed about the wedding. He threw himself into trying to save his father's company, working 18-hour days and mortgaging his future to keep the business afloat. He was fighting for their life together, battling to preserve the world he wanted to give her. He never saw the betrayal coming. The end came on a night much like this one, rain lashing the windows, the sky weeping as if it knew what was about to happen. Micah had come home to their shared apartment exhausted but hopeful, clutching a small victory in the form of a potential investor who might save the company. He had been planning to surprise Serafina with dinner and the good news, to show her that he was still the man worthy of her love. Instead, he found her in the arms of Caspian Voss. The image was burned into his memory like a brand. Serafina, his beautiful fiancée, wrapped around his business rival, their bodies moving together with a passion that made a mockery of every moment she had ever shared with him. They were on the couch, where he had proposed to her just months before, and the sound of her moans was like a knife twisting in his chest. When she saw him standing in the doorway, she didn't even have the grace to look ashamed. She simply disentangled herself from Caspian with the casual indifference of a woman who had already made her choice, smoothing down her dress as if she were adjusting her appearance after a business meeting. "Micah," she said, her voice steady and cold, "we need to talk." The conversation that followed was a masterclass in cruelty. Serafina explained with the detached precision of a surgeon that she couldn't marry a man who was about to lose everything. She had needs, she said, standards that he could no longer meet. Caspian could give her the life she deserved, the penthouse apartment, the designer clothes, the social status that came with dating a man who was succeeding rather than failing. "You understand, don't you?" she had asked, her dark eyes empty of the love that had once lived there. "I can't throw my life away on a fantasy." The divorce papers were served the next morning, along with a demand for half of everything he owned. By the time the lawyers were finished, Micah was left with nothing but debt and the bitter knowledge that the woman he had loved more than life itself had never loved him at all. His father's company collapsed 6 months later, taking with it the last remnants of the Canant family fortune. His father died of a heart attack 2 years after that, broken by the loss of everything he had built. Micah blamed himself, convinced that if he had been stronger, smarter, more worthy of love, none of it would have happened. The depression that followed was like drowning in darkness. For 2 years, he barely functioned, surviving on rage and the desperate need to prove that he was not the weak, pathetic man that Serafina had discarded. He threw himself into rebuilding with the fury of a man possessed, working 20-hour days, making deals with a ruthlessness that shocked even his enemies. But success, when it came, was built on the foundation of his frozen heart. He trusted no one, loved no one, allowed no one close enough to hurt him again. Women were temporary distractions, business partners were tools to be used, and emotions were weaknesses to be eliminated. He hired male assistants, male executives, male staff whenever possible, and the few women who worked for him were treated with the cold professionalism of a man who had learned that the fairer sex was anything but fair. Now, standing in his tower of glass and steel, Micah was worth more than Serafina and Caspian combined. He had destroyed Caspian's business empire piece by piece over the years, a patient and methodical revenge that had left his former rival bankrupt and broken. He had heard through the social circles that Serafina's marriage had crumbled, that she was living off alimony and the fading remnants of her beauty. But none of it mattered. None of it filled the hollow space where his heart used to be. The clock on his desk chimed midnight, and Micah carefully folded the divorce papers back into their envelope, returning them to the safe where they lived like a talisman of his pain. Tomorrow, he would be the Ice King again, feared and respected and utterly alone. As he reached for his coat, preparing to leave the office that had become more of a home than his penthouse ever would be, Micah made the same vow he had made every October 15th for 30 years. "Never again will I let anyone close enough to destroy me." He had no idea that in less than 12 hours, a woman with eyes like starlight and a smile that could melt glaciers would walk into his building and change everything forever. The storm outside began to calm, as if the universe itself was holding its breath for what was about to come. But Micah Canant, the man who had forgotten how to hope, simply turned off the lights and walked into the night, carrying his broken heart like a burden he was destined to bear alone. Forever. Chapter 2. When Dawn Breaks Through. There are angels who wear scrubs and save lives in hospitals, and then there are angels who wear cleaning uniforms and save souls in the quiet hours when the world sleeps. Chantal Renee stepped off the subway at Wall Street Station, her heart heavy with the weight of impossible choices and the kind of exhaustion that came from loving someone too much to let them go. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter, and she pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders as she made her way through the empty streets toward Canant Industries, the gleaming tower that represented her newest chance to earn the money that could save her grandmother's life. At 28, Chantal had learned that life was a series of small miracles wrapped in enormous struggles. She worked 3 jobs, cleaning offices at night, serving coffee during the morning rush, and stocking shelves at a grocery store in the afternoons, and still barely made enough to cover her rent and send money to Trinidad, where her beloved grandmother Cordelia Baptiste was fighting a losing battle against cancer. But despite the crushing weight of her responsibilities, despite the bone-deep weariness that came from sleeping only 4 hours a night, Chantal carried herself with a grace that made people stop and stare. She had the kind of beauty that came from within, warm brown eyes that sparkled with genuine kindness, a smile that could light up the darkest corners of despair, and a laugh that sounded like music even when she was too tired to remember why she was laughing. Her grandmother had raised her with stories about the power of love, about how kindness was the only currency that mattered in this world, about how everyone, no matter how broken or bitter, deserved compassion. Cordelia had taught her that cleaning wasn't just about removing dirt, it was about creating spaces where people could find peace, where they could breathe a little easier, where they could remember that the world still held beauty. Every surface you clean, every floor you polish, every window you make shine, Cordelia would say in her melodious Caribbean accent. You're not just working, baby girl. You're spreading love. You're making the world a little brighter for someone who might need that light to find their way home. Chantal carried those words with her as she entered the marble lobby of Canant Industries, her reflection multiplied in the polished surfaces that spoke of wealth beyond imagination. The building was a monument to success, 50 floors of glass and steel reaching toward the sky like a prayer made of ambition and dreams. The security guard, a kind-faced man named Roberto, greeted her with the warmth reserved for someone who had earned respect through genuine decency. Evening, Miss Renee. How's your grandmother doing? She's fighting, Chantal replied, her voice carrying the weight of love and worry. The doctors say the new treatment is showing promise, but... She trailed off, unable to voice the fear that lived in her chest like a constant ache. Roberto nodded with understanding. He had worked the night shift for 15 years, watching people come and go, and he had learned to recognize the ones who carried the world on their shoulders. She's lucky to have you, miss. That kind of love, it's powerful medicine. Chantal smiled, the expression transforming her tired features into something luminous. Thank you, Roberto. That's exactly what she would say. As she made her way to the service elevator, Chantal's phone buzzed with a text from her roommate and best friend, Zinnia Beaumont. Girl, you're working too hard. When's the last time you did something just for you? When's the last time you smiled because you wanted to, not because you had to? Chantal stared at the message, trying to remember the last time she had felt genuine joy instead of just gratitude for making it through another day. She couldn't remember, and that realization made her heart ache in a way that had nothing to do with her grandmother's illness. The executive floors of Canant Industries were a study in understated luxury, marble floors that gleamed like mirrors, artwork that cost more than most people made in a year, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the city that never slept. But to Chantal, it was just another workspace, another opportunity to practice the art of caring for others that her grandmother had taught her. She began her routine with the methodical precision of someone who took pride in their work, no matter how humble others might consider it. She emptied trash cans, wiped down surfaces, and polished everything until it gleamed. But she did it with a reverence that transformed the mundane into something sacred. As she worked, she hummed softly. A lullaby her grandmother had sung to her as a child, a melody that spoke of home and love, and the unbreakable bonds that held families together across oceans and heartbreak. The song filled the empty corridors with warmth, turning the sterile corporate environment into something that felt almost alive. She was polishing the conference table on the 48th floor when she heard it, a sound that made her heart clench with recognition. Someone was crying, not the loud, dramatic tears of anger or frustration, but the quiet, desperate sobs of someone who had forgotten how to hope. Chantal followed the sound to the corner office at the end of the hall, where a sliver of light escaped from under the door. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the handle. Her supervisor, Amara Kingsley, had been clear about the rules. Clean efficiently, don't disturb anyone, and absolutely never enter an office while someone was working. But Cordelia's voice echoed in her mind. Baby girl, rules are important, but compassion is sacred. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply show up for someone who's forgotten they deserve to be seen. Chantal knocked softly, her voice gentle as she called out, "Excuse me. Are you all right in there?" The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of someone trying to compose themselves. After a moment, a deep voice, rough with emotion, answered, "I'm fine. Please, just leave me alone." But Chantal had spent her life learning to read the spaces between words, to hear the pain that people tried to hide behind politeness. This wasn't a man who wanted to be alone. This was a man who had forgotten that he didn't have to be. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who had never met a stranger. "I'm Chantal, and I was just cleaning out here. I couldn't help but notice that you sound like maybe you could use some company, or maybe just a cup of coffee." There was a long silence, and then the sound of footsteps approaching the door. When it opened, Chantal found herself looking up at a man who took her breath away. Not because of his wealth or power, but because of the raw vulnerability in his eyes. Micah Canant stood in the doorway like a man who had forgotten how to be human. His dark hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his eyes, God, his eyes, held the kind of pain that came from carrying the weight of the world alone for too long. He was handsome in the way that powerful men often were, but there was something broken in his expression that made Chantal's heart ache with recognition. "You're new," he said, his voice carefully controlled but not quite steady. "Yes, sir. This is my first night cleaning this floor." Chantal met his gaze without flinching, her own eyes soft with the kind of compassion that couldn't be taught or faked. "I'm sorry if I disturbed you. You sounded like you might need someone to remind you that you're not alone." Micah stared at her, his carefully constructed walls crumbling in the face of her genuine kindness. This woman, this stranger, was looking at him not like the feared Ice King who could destroy companies with a word, but like a human being who deserved care and concern. "You don't know who I am," he said, and there was something almost desperate in his voice, as if he was afraid that once she knew she would run. Chantal smiled, the expression transforming her tired features into something radiant. "I know you're someone who's working too late and hurting too much, and that's all I need to know. Would you like me to make you some coffee?" I noticed there's a machine in the break room, and my grandmother always said that coffee tastes better when it's made with caring hands. For the first time in 30 years, Micah found himself completely speechless. This woman, this angel disguised as a cleaning lady, was offering him kindness without expectation, compassion without condition, humanity without judgment. "I don't even know your name," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Chantal Renee," she replied, extending her hand with the easy grace of someone who had never learned to be intimidated by power or wealth. "And you are?" "Micah," he said, taking her hand and feeling something electric pass between them. "Just Micah." As their eyes met in the soft light of the office, something shifted between them. A recognition, a connection, a spark of possibility that neither had felt in years. The broken executive felt his frozen heart crack, just a little, and for the first time in 30 years, he remembered what it felt like to hope. Chantal, looking into the eyes of this wounded man, felt something stir in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with recognition. She was looking at someone who had forgotten how to be loved, and she was someone who had been born to love. "It's nice to meet you, Micah," she said, her voice carrying the promise of dawn after the longest night. "Now, about that coffee." And as she turned to walk toward the break room, humming softly under her breath, Micah Canant stood frozen in his doorway, watching an angel in cleaning clothes carry light into the darkest corners of his soul. He didn't know it yet, but his life had just begun. Chapter 3. Hearts Learning to Trust. The heart is a stubborn thing. It will choose to love even when the mind screams warnings, even when logic demands retreat, even when 30 years of carefully constructed walls stand between you and the possibility of happiness. 6 weeks had passed since Chantal Renee had walked into Micah Canant's life like dawn breaking over a wasteland, and every night since he had found himself counting the hours until she arrived. The Ice King, the man who had built an empire on his ability to remain coldly detached from human emotion, now lived for the sound of her soft humming echoing through the empty corridors of his building. He had never been a man who believed in miracles, but there was no other word for what Chantal had brought into his world. She cleaned offices, but somehow she was polishing the tarnished corners of his soul. She emptied trash cans, but she was filling the hollow spaces in his chest with something that felt dangerously like hope. Micah found himself staying later and later at the office, manufacturing crises that required his immediate attention, scheduling calls with international clients that could only happen after midnight. His assistant, Atticus Ravencrest, had started giving him concerned looks, clearly puzzled by his boss's sudden dedication to working through the night. "Sir," Atticus had said that morning, his voice carefully neutral, "you've been here past 2 in the morning every night this week. Perhaps you should consider—" "I'm fine, Atticus," Micah had cut him off, his tone sharper than necessary. "I work better at night, fewer distractions." But that was a lie. There were more distractions now than ever before. The anticipation of her arrival, the way his heart stuttered when he heard her voice, the impossible sweetness of their conversations that stretched long into the night. Chantal was the most beautiful distraction he had ever known, and he was addicted to her presence like a man drowning in darkness, suddenly given glimpses of sunlight. She arrived at 11:30, as she did every night, her smile bright enough to illuminate the marble lobby. Micah watched from his office window as she exchanged pleasantries with Roberto, the security guard, asking about his wife's recovery from surgery, remembering that his grandson had a baseball game that weekend. She treated everyone with the same genuine warmth, as if their stories mattered to her, as if their happiness was somehow connected to her own. When she stepped off the elevator on the 48th floor, Micah felt his pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with business deals or corporate conquests. She was wearing the same simple uniform she always wore, navy blue pants and a matching shirt with Canant Industries cleaning services embroidered on the pocket, but somehow she made it look elegant, as if she were dressed for a royal ball rather than a night of janitorial work. "Evening, Micah," she called out, her voice carrying the warmth of home and the promise of peace. "How was your day?" The question was simple, ordinary, the kind of thing that people asked each other 1,000,000 times without thinking. But no one had asked Micah about his day in years, not in a way that suggested they actually cared about the answer. His employees feared him, his business associates respected him, and his family. Well, his sister Odette tried, but even she had learned to keep her distance from the man he had become. "It was better once you arrived," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. He felt heat rise in his cheeks, a blush that would have been impossible for the Ice King, but seemed perfectly natural for the man Chantal was helping him remember he could be. She smiled, and it was like watching the sun rise over the ocean. "You're sweet. Have you eaten dinner? I brought extra sandwiches again. My grandmother always said that food tastes better when it's shared." This had become their ritual. Every night, Chantal would arrive with a small cooler containing homemade sandwiches, fruit, and a thermos of coffee that tasted like it had been blessed by angels. She would share her simple meal with him as if he were a beloved friend rather than a billionaire who could buy restaurants on a whim. "Tell me about your grandmother," Micah said, as they settled into their usual spot in the conference room, the city lights twinkling below them like earthbound stars. "You talk about her like she's the most important person in the world." Chantal's face softened with love so pure it made Micah's chest ache. "She is. Cordelia Baptiste raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 7. She was a schoolteacher in Trinidad, and she taught me everything that matters. How to be kind, how to find joy in small things, how to love without fear." "Without fear," Micah repeated, the words foreign on his tongue. "I don't think I remember how to do that." "It's not something you remember," Chantal said gently, her dark eyes holding his with steady compassion. "It's something you choose every day, even when it's terrifying, especially when it's terrifying." She told him about her grandmother's garden, where she grew the most beautiful roses in the Caribbean, about the stories Cordelia would tell about her own childhood, about the way she would sing while she cooked, filling their small house with music and laughter. She spoke of a woman who had lost her husband young but had never lost her faith in love, who had raised her granddaughter to believe that kindness was the strongest force in the universe. "She's sick now," Chantal said quietly, her voice breaking slightly. "Cancer. The treatments are expensive and I'm trying to save enough to bring her here for better care, but—" She trailed off, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her coffee cup. Micah felt something twist in his chest, a pain that had nothing to do with his own wounds and everything to do with hers. This woman, this angel, was working herself to exhaustion to save the person she loved most, and she was doing it with grace and dignity that humbled him. "How much?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "What?" Chantal looked confused. "How much do you need?" "For the treatments, for bringing her here." Micah leaned forward, his businessman's mind already calculating costs and solutions. "I can—" "No." Chantal's voice was firm but kind. "I appreciate the thought, Micah, I really do. But I can't accept that. She's my responsibility, my family. I have to do this myself." "But why?" Micah couldn't understand her refusal. He had the resources to solve her problems with a single phone call, to eliminate the worry that was etching lines around her beautiful eyes. "I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. Let me help you." Chantal reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, her touch like electricity running through his veins. "Because that's not what love is, Micah. Love isn't about having someone solve your problems for you. It's about standing beside someone while they solve their own problems, offering your strength when they're weak, your hope when they're scared. Her words hit him like a physical blow. He thought of Serafina, who had loved his money and his status, but had abandoned him the moment his strength had wavered. He thought of 30 years of relationships built on transactions rather than connection, of a life where every kindness had come with a price tag. "I don't think anyone has ever loved me the way you love your grandmother," he said quietly, the admission torn from someplace deep inside him. "That's not true," Chantal said, her voice gentle but certain. "Your sister loves you like that. I can hear it in your voice when you talk about her. And your assistant, Atticus, he's protective of you in a way that goes beyond professional loyalty." Micah blinked, startled by her insight. It was true that Odette had never given up on him, despite his best efforts to push her away, and Atticus had been with him for 8 years, turning down higher-paying positions to stay by his side. But he had always assumed their loyalty was based on duty or mutual benefit, not genuine care. "You see things differently than I do," he said. "I see people the way my grandmother taught me to see them," Chantal replied. "Not as they are in this moment, but as they could be if they remembered how to love themselves. You're not as alone as you think you are, Micah. You're just scared to believe that you deserve the love that's already there." They talked until nearly dawn, sharing stories that neither of them had told anyone else. Micah found himself speaking of his father, of the guilt he carried for not being able to save the family business, of the dreams he had buried along with his trust in love. Chantal listened without judgment, her presence a balm to wounds that had festered for decades. When she finally left, promising to see him the next night, Micah sat alone in his office as the sun rose over Manhattan. For the first time in 30 years, he felt something that might have been peace. This woman, this miracle in cleaning clothes, was teaching him that maybe, just maybe, he was worthy of love after all. He picked up his phone and dialed his sister's number. When Odette answered, her voice heavy with sleep and concern, he said the words he hadn't spoken in years. "I think I'm falling in love, and I'm terrified." The silence stretched between them, and then Odette's voice, warm with tears and hope. "Tell me about her." As Micah began to speak, describing Chantal's kindness, her strength, her beautiful heart, he realized that for the first time in 30 years, he was looking forward to tomorrow. Not because of a business deal or a corporate victory, but because tomorrow night an angel would walk into his building again, and maybe, just maybe, she would help him remember how to be human. The Ice King was beginning to thaw, and it was the most terrifying and wonderful thing that had ever happened to him. Chapter 4. The Courage to Feel Again. Love doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It creeps into your life like morning mist, soft and subtle, until suddenly you realize you can't imagine breathing without it. 8 weeks had passed since Chantal Renee had become the center of Micah Cannant's universe, and the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The man who had spent 3 decades perfecting the art of isolation found himself counting minutes until 11:30 each night, when the elevator would deliver his salvation in the form of a woman who saw his soul instead of his bank account. But love, Micah was learning, was more than stolen conversations and shared sandwiches. Love was the desperate need to ease someone's pain, even if they would never know you were the one who had lifted their burden. He sat in his office on a Tuesday morning, staring at the investigative report that Atticus had discreetly commissioned. The folder contained everything about Chantal's life: her grandmother's medical records, the costs of treatment, the 3 jobs she worked to make ends meet, the tiny apartment she shared with her friend Zinnia Beaumont. But more than the facts, it contained the story of a woman who was slowly killing herself trying to save the person she loved most. Cordelia Baptiste's cancer was aggressive, and the treatments available in Trinidad were limited. The report estimated that bringing her to New York for experimental therapy would cost close to $200,000, money that Chantal would need a lifetime to earn at her current pace. Micah had built his fortune on making difficult decisions quickly, but this was different. This wasn't about profit margins or market share. This was about the woman who had become his reason for existing, and he knew that approaching her directly would only push her away. "Atticus," he called to his assistant, who appeared in the doorway with the efficiency of someone who had learned to anticipate his boss's needs. "Yes, sir. I need you to set up a charitable foundation, something focused on providing medical care for immigrants and their families. Make it legitimate, well-funded, and ensure that it can provide grants quickly and quietly." Atticus's eyebrows rose slightly, but he was too professional to voice his surprise. "Of course, sir. What would you like to call it?" Micah thought of Chantal's stories about her grandmother's garden, about roses that bloomed despite the harsh Caribbean sun. The Cordelia Foundation, and Atticus. I want the first grant to go to a woman named Cordelia Baptiste in Trinidad. Full medical coverage, transportation costs, everything she needs. I'll have the paperwork ready by tomorrow, sir. Good. And Atticus? This needs to appear completely legitimate. No connection to me or to Canant Industries. Can you arrange that? Absolutely, sir. Atticus paused. If I may ask, sir, this is about Miss Renee, isn't it? Micah looked up, surprised by the question. In 8 years of working together, Atticus had never pried into his personal life. How did you... You're different, sir. You smile when you read her texts. You've started saying good morning to the staff. Yesterday you asked me about my weekend plans. Atticus's voice was warm with something that might have been pride. In all the years I've worked for you, I've never seen you happy. She's good for you. I'm terrified I'm not good for her, Micah admitted, the words coming out in a rush. She's sunshine and hope and everything beautiful in this world, and I'm... You're a man who's been alone for too long, Atticus said gently. But you're not the same man who hired me 8 years ago. You're not even the same man who walked into this office 2 months ago. That's what love does. It changes us, usually for the better. That night, Micah waited for Chantal with the nervous energy of a teenager preparing for his first date. He had spent the day thinking about Atticus's words, about the changes that loving Chantal had wrought in his life. He was softer now, more aware of the people around him, more willing to see the humanity in others. When she arrived, her smile was brighter than usual, and there was something almost electric in her energy. You look like you have good news, Micah said, his heart lifting at the sight of her joy. I do, she said, her voice bubbling with excitement. I got a call today from something called the Cordelia Foundation. They're going to pay for my grandmother's treatment and bring her to New York for experimental therapy. Can you believe it? It's like a miracle. Micah felt his chest tighten with emotion as he watched her happiness. This was what love looked like, not the desperate need to possess someone, but the profound joy of seeing them free from worry. That's wonderful, Chantal. You must be so relieved. I am, she said, tears streaming down her face. I keep thinking about how my grandmother always said that when you put love out into the world, it comes back to you tenfold. I've been working so hard to save money for her treatment. And now this foundation just appears out of nowhere. It's like the universe was listening. Tell me about her, Micah said softly, settling into his chair across from her. What will she think of New York? Chantal's face lit up with love and anticipation. She'll be amazed by everything. She's never been anywhere except Trinidad, but she's always been curious about the world. She used to make me tell her stories about the people I met, the places I'd been. She said that every person carries a piece of their homeland with them, and she wanted to collect those pieces like treasures. She sounds like she raised you well, Micah said, thinking of his own grandmother, who had died when he was 12, but who had taught him about kindness before the world had taught him about cruelty. She did. She taught me that love isn't something you hoard, it's something you share. The more you give away, the more you have. Chantel reached across the table and took his hand, her touch sending electricity through his entire body. She's going to love you, Micah. I talk about you in my letters to her, and she always asks about the lonely man who works too late and needs someone to remind him that he's not alone. You write to her about me? Micah's voice was barely above a whisper. Every week. I tell her about your kindness, about how you listen to my stories, about how you make me feel less alone in this big city. Chantel's eyes were soft with affection. She says that anyone who can make her granddaughter smile the way you do must have a beautiful heart, even if he's forgotten how to see it. Micah felt tears prick his eyes, emotions he had suppressed for decades threatening to overflow. I don't know if I have a beautiful heart, Chantel. I've done things. I've been cold and cruel and... That's not who you are, she interrupted firmly. That's who you became to protect yourself. But I see the real you, Micah. I see the man who stays up all night talking to the cleaning lady because he recognizes loneliness in someone else. I see the man who remembers that I mentioned my grandmother's favorite flowers and somehow finds a way to have gardenias waiting for me on particularly hard days. Micah's breath caught. He had been leaving flowers for her, always unsigned, always mysterious. He hadn't realized she knew they were from him. You knew? He asked. I hoped, she said, her smile tender. The first time I found gardenias on my cleaning cart, I thought it was a coincidence. But then it happened again and again, always on nights when I'd told you I was particularly worried about my grandmother. Who else would have been paying that much attention to my stories? I wanted to do more, Micah said, his voice rough with emotion. I wanted to solve everything for you, to take away all your worries and fears. But you wouldn't let me. Because that's not what love is, Chantel said gently. Love isn't about having someone solve your problems for you. It's about having someone stand beside you while you solve them yourself. It's about knowing that whatever happens, you're not facing it alone. I've been alone for so long, Micah admitted. I forgot what it felt like to have someone care about my day, to worry about me, to love me. You're not alone anymore, Chantel said, her voice steady and sure. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, their hands intertwined across the table, the city lights twinkling below them like promises of tomorrow. Micah realized that this was what happiness felt like, not the rush of closing a deal or the satisfaction of destroying a competitor, but the quiet contentment of being truly seen and accepted by another person. Chantel, he said quietly, I need to tell you something. What is it? I think I'm falling in love with you. The words hung in the air between them, vulnerable and honest and terrifying. Chantel's smile was radiant. I think I'm falling in love with you too, Micah. And it's the most beautiful feeling in the world. As they leaned across the table toward each other, their lips meeting in a kiss that was soft and sweet and full of promise, Micah felt something inside him heal. The Ice King was melting, and in his place was a man who remembered how to hope, how to trust, how to love without fear. When they finally pulled apart, both of them breathing hard, Chantel rested her forehead against his. My grandmother always said that love is the only thing that makes life worth living. I never understood what she meant until now. Now I understand why you work so hard to save her, Micah said, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her cheek. She created something beautiful in you, and that beauty is changing me. We're changing each other, Chantal corrected softly. That's what love does. It makes us better than we ever thought we could be. As they held each other in the quiet of the office, surrounded by the city that never slept, Micah knew that his life had been divided into two parts, before Chantal and after. And the after was going to be more beautiful than anything he had ever dared to imagine. The man who had spent 30 years believing he was unworthy of love had finally found someone who saw his worth, and he was never going to let her go. Chapter 5. Falling Without Fear. Sometimes the most profound declarations of love come wrapped in the most ridiculous moments, proving that the heart cares nothing for dignity when it finally finds the courage to speak its truth. Micah Canant had spent 3 sleepless nights rehearsing what he would say to Chantal Renee, pacing the marble floors of his penthouse like a caged tiger, crafting and discarding speeches that never seemed adequate to contain the enormity of what he felt for her. He had conquered boardrooms filled with hostile executives, had stared down senators and foreign ministers, had negotiated deals worth billions without breaking a sweat. But the thought of telling a woman in a cleaning uniform that she had become his entire world left him trembling like a schoolboy. The morning of the 4th day dawned grey and drizzling, as if the sky itself was reflecting his nervous energy. He stood before his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the 100th time, practicing the words that would either change his life forever or shatter what remained of his carefully reconstructed heart. "Chantal," he said to his reflection, his voice barely steady, "I know this might seem impossible, but I need you to know that you've become everything to me. You've taken a man who forgot how to feel and taught him how to love again." The words sounded hollow in the empty bathroom, lacking the warmth and sincerity he felt in his chest. How could mere language capture the way she made him feel alive for the first time in 30 years? How could he explain that her smile had become his religion, her laugh his favorite song, her presence the only thing that made sense in a world that had always felt cold and meaningless? By the time evening arrived, Micah was a wreck. He had cancelled 3 meetings, snapped at Atticus twice, and spent the entire day staring at his phone, composing and deleting text messages that never seemed to capture what he needed to say. When the clock struck 11, he positioned himself near the elevators, his heart hammering against his ribs like a bird desperate to escape its cage. The elevator doors opened with their familiar chime, and Micah stepped forward, his prepared speech on his lips, his hands trembling with nervous energy. But in his anxiety, in his desperate need to finally voice the feelings that had been consuming him for weeks, he approached the first figure to emerge from the elevator without really looking. "Chantal," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I need to tell you something that I should have said weeks ago. You've changed my life in ways I never thought possible. You've taken a man who was dead inside and made him remember what it means to be alive. I know I'm not worthy of someone like you, someone so good and pure and beautiful, but I'm hoping—" Sir?" A confused male voice interrupted his passionate declaration. "I think you might have me confused with someone else." Micah looked up, his words dying in his throat as he realized he was staring into the bewildered face of Orion Blackwell, the young male janitor who worked the night shift on the lower floors. The kid, he couldn't be more than 22, was staring at him with a mixture of confusion and genuine concern, his cleaning cart forgotten beside him. "I'm not Chantal, sir," Orion said gently, his voice kind, despite the awkwardness of the situation. "But, she's right behind me. And just so you know, what you were saying sounded really beautiful. I hope she appreciates it." Micah felt heat flood his cheeks, embarrassment mixing with nervous energy to create a cocktail of emotions that left him speechless. Behind Orion, he could see Chantal emerging from the elevator, her eyes wide with surprise and something that might have been delight. "Oh my God," Micah breathed, running his hands through his hair. "I'm so sorry, Orion. I didn't mean to—" "No worries, Mr. Kennant," Orion said, with a grin that suggested he was enjoying the unprecedented sight of his usually composed boss, completely flustered. "I've been mistaken for a lot of things, but never for a beautiful woman. That's a first." Chantal approached them, her expression soft with affection, as she took in Micah's mortified state. "It's okay, Orion. I'll take it from here." "Good luck, Miss Renee," Orion said, giving her an encouraging smile before heading toward the service elevator. "I think you're going to like what he has to say." As Orion disappeared around the corner, Micah and Chantal stood alone in the marble hallway, the weight of his aborted declaration hanging between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Micah had never felt more vulnerable, more exposed, more terrified of what might happen next. "So," Chantal said, her voice gentle and warm, "did you have something you wanted to tell me?" Micah looked at her, really looked at her, and felt his heart skip a beat. She was wearing her usual cleaning uniform, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her face free of makeup. She was beautiful in the way that sunrise was beautiful, in the way that rain was beautiful, in the way that hope was beautiful after a long season of despair. "I'm in love with you," he said, the words tumbling out without preamble or poetry. "I'm desperately, completely, utterly in love with you, and I needed you to know." Chantal's breath caught, her eyes filling with tears that sparkled like diamonds in the hallway lights. "Micah." "I know it's crazy," he continued, the words pouring out of him like water from a broken dam. "I know I'm too old for you, too damaged, too set in my ways. I know I have no right to ask someone like you to love someone like me. But I can't keep pretending that what I feel for you is friendship or gratitude or anything other than the most profound love I've ever experienced." He stepped closer, his hands reaching for hers, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You've saved me, Chantal. You've taken a man who was drowning in his own bitterness and taught him how to breathe again. You've shown me that the world can be beautiful, that people can be good, that love doesn't have to be a weapon used to destroy." "You're not too old," Chantal said softly, her tears flowing freely now. "You're not too damaged. You're not too anything. You're just a man who's been hurt, who's been alone, who's forgotten how beautiful he is." "I don't feel beautiful," Micah admitted, his voice breaking. "I feel like I'm made of sharp edges and broken glass. I feel like I'll hurt you just by loving you." Chantal reached up and cupped his face in her hands, her touch gentle and warm and infinitely precious. "Love isn't about being perfect, Micah. It's about being real. It's about trusting someone with your broken pieces and letting them help you put them back together. I've never trusted anyone the way I trust you," he said, leaning into her touch. "I've never wanted to be worthy of someone the way I want to be worthy of you." "You already are worthy," she whispered, her thumbs brushing away tears he hadn't realized were falling. "You've been worthy all along. You just needed someone to help you remember." "I love you," he said again, the words feeling like a prayer, like a vow, like the most important thing he had ever said. "I love your kindness, your strength, your beautiful heart. I love the way you see the world, the way you make me want to be better than I am. I love the way you make me feel like I'm home." "I love you too," Chantal said, her voice steady and sure despite her tears. "I love your vulnerability, your intelligence, your capacity for tenderness. I love the way you listen to my stories, the way you remember what matters to me. I love the way you make me feel like I'm the most important person in your world." "You are," Micah said fiercely. "You're the most important person in any world. You're my world." They stood there in the hallway, holding each other, crying and laughing and marveling at the miracle of finding love when neither of them had been looking for it. The building around them was silent, except for the distant hum of machinery and the soft whisper of their breathing. But to Micah, it felt like the entire universe was celebrating. "What happens now?" Chantal asked, her voice muffled against his chest. "Now," Micah said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, "now we figure out how to build a life together. Now we learn how to love each other without fear. Now we discover what it means to be happy." "I'm scared," she admitted, her arms tightening around him. "I'm scared of getting hurt, of not being enough, of this all being too good to be true." "I'm terrified," Micah confessed, "but I'm more terrified of living without you than I am of living with you. I'm more afraid of letting fear win than I am of letting love win." "My grandmother always said that love is the only thing worth being brave for," Chantal said, pulling back to look at him. "She said that everything else in life is just noise. But love, real love, is the music that makes the noise bearable." "Then let's be brave," Micah said, his hands framing her face. "Let's be brave and foolish and completely, utterly in love." "Yes," Chantal breathed, rising up on her toes to meet his lips. "Yes to all of it." Their kiss was soft and sweet and full of promise, a seal on vows spoken in a marble hallway under fluorescent lights. It tasted like hope and felt like coming home, and when they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling through their tears. "I love you," Micah whispered against her forehead. "I love you too," she whispered back, "and I'm not going anywhere." As they held each other in the quiet of the building, surrounded by the city that never slept, Micah knew that his life had just begun. The Ice King was gone, melted away by the warmth of a woman who had seen his worth when he had forgotten it existed. And for the first time in 30 years, he wasn't afraid of tomorrow. Chapter 6. Love's Sweet Surrender. There is a moment in every great love story when two souls stop dancing around each other and finally surrender to the inevitable, when the walls come down, the masks fall away, and two people discover that they are, at last, truly home. The transformation in Micah Canant over the following weeks was nothing short of miraculous. The man who had spent 30 years perfecting the art of emotional detachment now approached love with the single-minded focus he had once reserved for hostile takeovers. But instead of conquering and destroying, he was learning to cherish and protect, to worship and adore, to love with a tenderness that surprised even him. Chantal had changed his entire understanding of what it meant to court a woman. This wasn't about expensive gifts or grand gestures designed to impress. This was about learning the language of her heart and speaking it fluently. He discovered that she preferred gardenias to roses because they reminded her of her grandmother's garden, that she loved old movies because they made her believe in happy endings, that she had never been on a proper date because every man she had ever known had been intimidated by her independence. "I want to give you everything you've never had," he told her one evening as they shared dinner in his penthouse, the city lights twinkling below them like earthbound stars. "I want to show you how a woman should be loved, how a woman should be treasured." "You already do," Chantal said, her eyes soft with affection. "Every night when you listen to my stories, every time you remember something I've told you, every moment when you make me feel like I'm the most important person in your world. That's how you show me love." But Micah wanted to give her more than just his attention. He wanted to give her experiences, memories, moments of pure joy that would last a lifetime. He arranged for a private screening of Casablanca in his penthouse theatre, complete with vintage champagne and her favorite chocolates. He took her to the botanical gardens at dawn, when they had the place to themselves, and watched her face light up as she walked among the flowers that reminded her of home. "You don't have to do all this," she said, as they danced slowly among the roses, her head resting against his chest, his heart beating steadily beneath her ear. "I know I don't have to," Micah replied, his lips pressed against her hair. I want to give you the world, Chantel. I want to make up for every man who didn't see your worth, every person who took you for granted, every moment of loneliness you've ever felt. You can't fix the past, she said gently, pulling back to look at him. And you don't need to. All I need is you, right here, right now, choosing to love me every day. Choosing to love you is the easiest thing I've ever done, he said, cupping her face in his hands. Living without you for 30 years, that was the hard part. Their relationship deepened with each passing day, built on a foundation of trust and vulnerability that neither of them had experienced before. Micah found himself sharing things he had never told anyone. His nightmares about his father's death, his fears about being unworthy of love, his dreams of a life that included more than just business and solitude. I used to think success meant being feared, he told her one night as they walked through Central Park, her hand warm in his. I thought if I was powerful enough, wealthy enough, untouchable enough, then I could never be hurt again. And now? Chantal asked, her voice gentle and understanding. Now I know that real success means being loved by someone who sees all of you, the good and the bad, the strong and the weak, and chooses to stay anyway. He stopped walking and turned to face her, his eyes intense with emotion. You've seen me at my worst, Chantal. You've seen me broken and bitter and afraid, and you're still here. I'm still here because I love all of you, she said, her voice steady and sure. I love your strength and your vulnerability, your intelligence and your kindness. I love the man you were before you were hurt, and I love the man you've become because of that hurt. All of it makes you who you are. I don't know how to be worthy of that kind of love, Micah admitted, his voice breaking slightly. You don't have to be worthy, Chantal said, reaching up to touch his face. You just have to be open to receiving it. You have to trust that when someone loves you, it's not because you've earned it or because you're perfect. It's because you're you, and that's enough. The moment she said those words, something shifted between them. The last wall around Micah's heart crumbled, and he found himself looking at her with a hunger that had nothing to do with food, and everything to do with the desperate need to be closer to her, to show her with his body what his words could never adequately express. Chantal, he said, her name a prayer on his lips, I need you. I need you in every way a man can need a woman. I need to show you how much I love you, how much you mean to me. I need you too, she whispered, her voice husky with desire. I've been waiting for you my whole life, Micah. I've been waiting for someone who would love me, not despite my flaws, but because of them. They went back to his penthouse, but the journey passed in a blur of stolen kisses and whispered endearments. By the time they reached his bedroom, they were both trembling with anticipation, with the knowledge that they were about to cross a threshold that would change everything between them. Are you sure? Micah asked, his hands gentle on her shoulders, his eyes searching hers for any sign of hesitation. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Chantal replied, her hands moving to the buttons of his shirt. I love you, Micah. I want to be with you completely and forever. What followed was the most tender and passionate night of either of their lives. They made love with the desperate intensity of people who had found their home in each other's arms, who had discovered that physical intimacy could be both an expression of love and a form of worship. Micah touched her as if she were made of delicate silk, his hands reverent as they explored every curve and hollow of her body. He whispered words of love and adoration against her skin, telling her how beautiful she was, how perfect, how much he needed her. You're everything, he breathed against her throat as they moved together in perfect harmony. You're my heart, my soul, my reason for being. I love you more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person. I love you too, Chantal gasped, her body arching against his, her hands clutching at his shoulders. "I love you so much it hurts. I love you so much I can't imagine existing without you." When they finally reached the peak of their passion, it was with a simultaneity that felt like destiny, like the universe itself was celebrating their union. They cried out each other's names as they surrendered to the overwhelming pleasure, their bodies and souls merging in a moment of perfect unity. Afterward, they lay entwined in the darkness, their breathing slowly returning to normal, their hearts beating in synchrony. Micah traced lazy patterns on Chantal's bare shoulder, marveling at the softness of her skin, the warmth of her body pressed against his. "I love you," he whispered into the darkness, the words carrying the weight of a vow. "I love you too," she replied, her voice sleepy and content. "More than the moon loves the night, more than the rain loves the earth." "Marry me," Micah said suddenly, the words surprising even him. "I know it's crazy, I know we haven't been together long, but I can't imagine spending another day without knowing that you're mine forever." Chantal lifted her head to look at him, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." They made love again, slower this time, with the lazy sensuality of people who had all the time in the world. They explored each other's bodies with the reverence of devoted worshippers, learning every sensitive spot, every secret place that made the other gasp with pleasure. "I want to memorize you," Micah said, his lips trailing fire across her skin. "I want to know every inch of you, every sound you make, every way you like to be touched." "We have forever," Chantal replied, her hands threading through his hair. "We have the rest of our lives to learn each other, to love each other, to discover new ways to make each other happy." As dawn broke over Manhattan, painting the bedroom in shades of gold and rose, they lay together in satisfied exhaustion, their bodies intertwined, their hearts beating as one. They had crossed the threshold from friendship to love, from love to passion, from passion to an unbreakable bond that would last for eternity. "I never knew it could be like this," Chantal said, her head pillowed on his chest, her fingers tracing abstract patterns on his skin. "Neither did I," Micah admitted, his arms tightening around her. "I thought I knew what love was, but what I felt for Serafina was just the shadow of what I feel for you. This is what real love feels like, complete, overwhelming, transformative." "This is what home feels like," Chantal agreed, pressing a kiss to his chest. "Right here in your arms is where I belong." As they drifted off to sleep, wrapped in each other's arms and surrounded by the golden light of morning, Micah knew that he had finally found what he had been searching for his entire life. Not success or power or wealth, but love. Pure, transformative, eternal love. The cold, ruthless businessman was gone forever, replaced by a man who had learned that the greatest victory was not in conquering others, but in surrendering to the one person who could conquer him completely. Chapter 7. The moment everything changed. Some moments are so perfect they feel like they were written by the angels themselves. When love and timing and fate converge to create something so beautiful, it takes your breath away and changes the very fabric of your existence. Micah Canant stood in the middle of his office at 10:30 on a Wednesday night, surrounded by enough gardenias to fill a small garden, his hands trembling as he adjusted the placement of candles for the 100th time. In his jacket pocket, nestled in a velvet box that had belonged to his grandmother, was a ring that had been waiting 60 years to find its destined finger. 3 weeks had passed since that magical night when they had first surrendered to their love, and every day since had been a revelation. Micah had discovered that happiness wasn't just an emotion, it was a state of being, a way of existing in the world that colored everything brighter, made every breath deeper, turned every ordinary moment into something extraordinary. He had become a man transformed, and everyone around him had noticed. Atticus no longer jumped when his boss entered the room because the Ice King no longer existed. In his place was a man who hummed under his breath, who smiled at strangers in elevators, who had started greeting the security guards by name and asking about their families. "Sir," Atticus had said that morning, his voice warm with affection, "I've worked for you for 8 years, and I've never seen you this happy. She's good for you." "She's everything for me," Micah had replied without hesitation. "She's my heart, my soul, my future. Tonight, I'm going to ask her to marry me." The ring had been his grandmother's, a stunning vintage piece with a center diamond surrounded by smaller stones that caught the light like captured stars. His grandmother had told him when he was just a boy that it was waiting for the woman who would love him not for what he had, but for who he was. "You'll know her when you meet her," she had said, her eyes twinkling with the wisdom of someone who had lived through her own great love story. "She'll be the one who sees your heart when everyone else only sees your mask." Now, as he made final adjustments to the romantic paradise he had created in his office, Micah knew that his grandmother had been right. Chantal saw him, not the billionaire, not the powerful CEO, but the man who had been broken and was learning to heal, who had been alone and was discovering what it meant to be cherished. The conference room had been transformed into something out of a fairy tale. Hundreds of gardenias created a fragrant white carpet that led from the elevator to the table where they shared their nightly meals. Candles flickered on every available surface, casting dancing shadows on the walls and filling the space with warm golden light. Rose petals had been scattered across the path, and soft music played from hidden speakers, the same melody she hummed while she worked, the lullaby her grandmother had sung to her as a child. At the center of it all was a simple setup, 2 chairs facing each other across a small table, with a bottle of champagne and a single gardenia in a crystal vase. It wasn't about extravagance or showing off his wealth. It was about creating a moment that would honor the love they had found in this very room, surrounded by the ordinary, made extraordinary by their presence. Micah checked his watch, 11:15. She would be here soon, and he felt like a teenager preparing for his first date. His heart was racing, his palms were sweating, and he had to resist the urge to pace. He had faced down hostile board members, had negotiated deals worth billions, had built an empire from nothing, but none of that had prepared him for the vulnerability of putting his heart on the line. He heard the elevator chime and took a deep breath, straightening his tie one final time. This was it, the moment that would determine the rest of his life. Either she would say yes, and they would begin there forever, or she would say no, and he would have to figure out how to exist in a world where the woman he loved more than life itself didn't want to be his wife. The elevator doors opened, and Chantal stepped out, her eyes immediately widening as she took in the transformed space. Her hand flew to her chest, her face a picture of wonder and delight as she absorbed the beauty of what he had created for her. "Micah," she breathed, her voice filled with awe. "What is all this?" "This," he said, stepping forward to take her hand, "is me trying to find a way to show you how much I love you, how much you mean to me, how much I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy." He led her slowly along the petal-strewn path, watching her face as she took in every detail. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, her smile radiant with joy, and he felt his heart swell with love so profound it almost brought him to his knees. "You did all this for me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I would do anything for you," Micah replied. his voice rough with emotion. "I would move mountains, drain oceans, rearrange the stars if it would make you smile. But tonight, all I want to do is ask you one question." When they reached the center of the room, Micah turned to face her, his hands trembling as he reached into his jacket pocket. The ring box felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, but it also felt like the most precious thing he had ever held. "Chantal," he began, his voice steady despite the chaos of emotions in his chest. "3 months ago, I was a man who had forgotten how to hope. I was drowning in my own bitterness, convinced that I was destined to spend the rest of my life alone. And then you walked into my world like sunrise after the longest night, and suddenly everything changed." He dropped to one knee, the ring box in his hands, his eyes never leaving hers. "You didn't just save me, my love. You transformed me. You took a man who was made of ice and shadows and taught him how to feel again, how to love again, how to believe in tomorrow again." Chantal's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized what was happening. "Micah, you are my heart," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "You are my home, my peace, my reason for being. You are the answer to every prayer I never dared to pray, the dream I never dared to dream. I love you more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you." He opened the ring box, revealing the vintage diamond that caught the candlelight like a captured star. "Chantal Renee, my beautiful angel, my beloved, my everything, will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner, my forever? Will you let me love you for the rest of my life?" For a moment, the world stood still. The candles flickered, the music played, and the gardenias filled the air with their sweet perfume. But all Micah could see was her face. All he could hear was the thunder of his own heartbeat as he waited for her answer. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, yes, oh God, yes." Micah's hands shook as he slipped the ring onto her finger, and then he was standing, pulling her into his arms, spinning her around as they both laughed and cried with joy. The ring fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her, as if his grandmother had somehow known that this moment would come. "I love you," he said, setting her down and cupping her face in his hands. "I love you so much, it feels like my heart might explode from happiness." "I love you too," she replied, her voice steady and sure despite her tears. "I love you more than words can say, more than the stars love the sky, more than the ocean loves the shore." Their kiss was everything a perfect kiss should be. Tender and passionate, sweet and desperate, filled with all the love and promise and hope that two people could share. They kissed surrounded by flowers and candlelight, in the very room where they had first discovered that love could heal even the deepest wounds. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, Chantal looked down at the ring on her finger and laughed through her tears. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." "It was my grandmother's," Micah said softly. "She told me it was waiting for the woman who would love me for who I am, not what I have. She told me I would know her when I met her." "She was right," Chantal said, her voice filled with wonder. "I fell in love with you when you were just a man crying alone in an office, when you were vulnerable and broken and beautiful. I didn't know you were rich or powerful or any of that. I just knew you were hurting, and I wanted to help." "You did more than help," Micah said, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her cheek. "You saved me. You gave me a reason to live again, a reason to hope again, a reason to believe in forever again." They spent the rest of the night in their transformed paradise, feeding each other strawberries and champagne, dancing to the soft music, planning their future with the excited enthusiasm of people who had found their soulmate. They talked about their wedding, about the children they wanted to have, about the life they would build together. "I want to meet your grandmother," Micah said as they swayed together in the candlelight. "I want to thank her for raising such an incredible woman. I want to ask for her blessing." "She's going to love you," Chantal said, her head resting against his chest. "She's going to see what I see, a man with a beautiful heart who just needed someone to remind him how to use it." As the night wore on, they made love surrounded by gardenias and candlelight, their bodies and souls joining in a celebration of their engagement, their commitment, their unbreakable bond. They whispered promises against each other's skin, made vows that had nothing to do with ceremonies or legal documents, and everything to do with the sacred connection between two people who had found their forever. "I can't wait to be your wife," Chantal murmured against his neck as they lay entwined afterward, their bodies still humming with satisfaction. "I can't wait to be your husband," Micah replied, his arms tightening around her. "I can't wait to wake up next to you every morning for the rest of my life." As dawn broke over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, they lay together in their flower-scented paradise, engaged and in love and perfectly, completely happy. The ruthless businessman was gone forever, replaced by a man who had learned that the greatest treasure in life wasn't money or power or success. It was love, pure, transformative, eternal love. And he had found it in the arms of an angel who wore cleaning clothes and carried starlight in her eyes. Chapter 8. Shadows of the Past. Happiness, like a butterfly, is delicate and beautiful and heartbreakingly easy to destroy. Sometimes all it takes is a single phone call in the middle of the night to shatter a love story that felt like it would last forever. Chantal Renee woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of her phone ringing with the kind of urgency that meant something was terribly wrong. She was in Micah's penthouse, in his bed, her engagement ring catching the moonlight as she reached for the device with trembling hands. Beside her, Micah stirred but didn't wake, his face peaceful in sleep, one arm still wrapped protectively around her waist. 2 weeks had passed since their magical engagement, 2 weeks of pure bliss as they planned their wedding and dreamed of their future together. The Cordelia Foundation had already arranged for her grandmother's transport to New York, and Cordelia Baptiste was due to arrive in just 3 days. Everything was perfect, their love story unfolding like a fairy tale, their happiness so complete it felt almost too good to be true. The caller ID showed her friend Marissa's number from Trinidad, and Chantal's heart immediately clenched with fear. Marissa would never call at this hour unless something was catastrophically wrong. "Hello," Chantal whispered, trying not to wake Micah. "Chantal," Marissa's voice was thick with tears, "you need to come home, now, tonight." "What's wrong? What happened?" Chantal was already sitting up, her free hand pressed against her chest, as if she could somehow protect her heart from what she was about to hear. "It's your grandmother," Marissa said, her voice breaking. "She's had a massive stroke. The doctors, they don't think she's going to make it through the night. She's been asking for you, honey. She keeps saying your name." The words hit Chantal like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs and making the room spin around her. Her grandmother, her beloved Cordelia, who had raised her with such love and wisdom, who had taught her everything that mattered about life and love and hope, was dying, and she was 1,000 miles away. "I'm coming," Chantal said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. "I'm coming right now." She hung up the phone and immediately began moving, her body operating on autopilot while her mind reeled with panic. She had to get to the airport, had to catch the first flight to Trinidad, had to be there for the woman who had been her entire world before she met Micah. "Chantal?" Micah's voice was groggy with sleep, confusion evident as he watched her throw clothes into a suitcase. "What's wrong? What's happening?" "My grandmother," she said, her voice breaking as tears began to stream down her face. "She's had a stroke. She's dying, Micah. I have to go to her. I have to go now." Micah was instantly awake, sitting up and reaching for her, his face creased with concern. "Of course you do. I'll come with you. We'll take my jet." "No," Chantal said, shaking her head frantically. "You don't understand. I have to go alone. This is something I have to do by myself." She was zipping up her suitcase, moving with the desperate efficiency of someone who knew that every second counted. Her phone was ringing again. Marissa, probably with updates she didn't want to hear. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the device. "Chantal, please," Micah said, standing and putting his hands on her shoulders. "Let me help you. Let me be there for you." "I can't," she said, pulling away from him. "I can't think about anything else right now. I can't worry about you or us or the wedding or anything except getting to her before it's too late." She was in survival mode, the same state she had been in since she was 7 years old and had learned that the people you loved most could be taken away from you in an instant. She couldn't process Micah's hurt expression or the way he was trying to help her. All she could think about was Cordelia, alone in a hospital bed, calling her name. "I'll call you when I get there," she said, grabbing her purse and heading for the door. "I'll explain everything when I can think straight. Chantal, wait." But she was already gone, running toward the elevator, her suitcase in one hand and her phone in the other as she tried to call a cab. The elevator doors closed on Micah's confused and hurt expression, and she immediately felt a stab of guilt that she couldn't afford to acknowledge. The next several hours passed in a blur of airports and anxiety. She caught a red-eye flight to Miami, then a connecting flight to Trinidad, her phone battery dying somewhere over the Caribbean. She had meant to call Micah from the airport, to explain properly, to tell him she loved him and that she would be back as soon as possible. But there hadn't been time. And now her phone was dead, and she was thousands of miles away from the man who had become her entire world. When she finally arrived at the hospital in Port of Spain, she found Cordelia unconscious but alive, her beautiful face peaceful, despite the machines that surrounded her bed. The doctors explained that the stroke had been massive, that even if she survived, she would never be the same woman who had raised Chantal with such love and wisdom. "She's been waiting for you," the nurse said gently. "She hasn't spoken since this morning, but every time we mention your name, her vitals spike. She knows you're here." Chantal took her grandmother's hand, the familiar warmth of that touch grounding her in a way that nothing else could. "I'm here, Grandmama," she whispered. "I'm here and I'm not leaving." Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away, Micah was pacing his penthouse like a caged animal, his phone in his hand as he tried to call Chantal for the 100th time. Her phone went straight to voicemail, and each failed attempt to reach her sent his anxiety spiraling higher. At first, he had been understanding. She was in crisis, her grandmother was dying, and she needed to focus on family. But as the hours stretched into days with no word from her, his old wounds began to reopen like infected cuts. By the 3rd day, Micah was no longer the man who had learned to love and trust. He was the broken 20-year-old who had been abandoned by the woman he loved when she decided he wasn't worth the trouble. The rational part of his mind knew that Chantal's situation was completely different from Serafina's betrayal, but the terrified part of his heart whispered that maybe love was an illusion. Maybe he was destined to be alone. Maybe he had been a fool to believe that someone like Chantal could really love someone like him. "She left," he told Atticus on the 4th day, his voice hollow and defeated. "She left without a word, without an explanation, without even saying goodbye, just like Serafina." "Sir," Atticus said gently, "Miss Renee isn't Serafina. She's dealing with a family emergency. I'm sure she'll call as soon as she can." "It's been 4 days," Micah said, staring out at the city that suddenly felt cold and empty again. 4 days without a single word. If she loved me, if she really loved me, she would have found a way to contact me. But Atticus's words fell on deaf ears. Micah had spent 30 years building walls around his heart, and it took only a few days of silence to convince him that those walls had been necessary. He began to retreat into himself, becoming cold and distant again, the warmth that Chantal had brought into his life slowly freezing over. In Trinidad, Chantal sat beside her grandmother's bed, holding her hand and telling her stories about New York, about Micah, about the love she had found and the life she was building. She hadn't left the hospital except to buy a phone charger, and when she finally got her phone working again, she had dozens of missed calls from Micah. But by then, it was too late. When she finally managed to call him back, his number went straight to voicemail. She tried again and again, but he wouldn't answer. She tried calling his office, but Atticus told her that Mr. Canant was unavailable and would call her back. He never did. "I think I've lost him," she told her unconscious grandmother, tears streaming down her face. "I think I've lost the love of my life because I couldn't be in two places at once." Cordelia's condition stabilized, but she remained unconscious, caught between life and death, while the two people who loved her most were trapped in their own private hells. Chantal refused to leave her side, afraid that if she went back to New York, she would return to find her grandmother gone. And Micah, convinced that he had been abandoned again, began to close his heart to the possibility of love. The fairy tale that had seemed so perfect just days before was crumbling under the weight of misunderstanding, fear, and the cruel timing of life's inevitable tragedies. Two people who loved each other desperately were being torn apart by the very circumstances that should have brought them closer together. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks stretched toward months, both Chantal and Micah began to believe that their love story was over before it had truly begun. They had found each other in the darkness, had discovered that love could heal even the deepest wounds, had promised to spend their lives together. But sometimes, love isn't enough to overcome the shadows of the past or the cruel realities of the present. Sometimes, even the most beautiful love stories are interrupted by tragedy, and the only question that remains is whether the love is strong enough to survive the interruption. In a hospital room in Trinidad, a woman sat beside her dying grandmother, staring at an engagement ring that felt like a relic from another life. And in a penthouse in Manhattan, a man stood at his window, watching the city lights blur through his tears, wondering if he was destined to spend the rest of his life alone. The cold, ruthless businessman had returned, and this time, he wasn't sure if even an angel could melt his frozen heart again. Chapter 9. Finding home in each other. Sometimes the deepest love stories are written in the language of almost loss, where two souls discover that nothing, not pride, not fear, not even the cruelest tricks of fate, can destroy a love that was meant to be eternal. 6 months had passed since that devastating night when Chantal Renee had vanished from Micah Canant's life like smoke in the wind, leaving behind only the lingering scent of gardenias and the echo of promises that now felt like beautiful lies. 6 months of sleepless nights, of unanswered phone calls, of a man slowly dying from the inside out while the world around him continued to spin as if his heart hadn't been ripped from his chest. Micah stood in his office at 2 a.m, staring at the same spot where he had proposed to her, where they had made love surrounded by flowers and candlelight, where she had said yes to forever before disappearing into the night. The room had been restored to its original sterile perfection, but he could still smell the gardenias, could still hear the echo of her laughter, could still feel the phantom warmth of her body pressed against his. The Ice King had returned with a vengeance, colder and more ruthless than he had ever been before. He had fired 3 assistants for the crime of reminding him of her kindness, had destroyed 2 business partnerships because their success felt like a mockery of his personal failure, had driven away anyone who dared to suggest that maybe, just maybe, there was a reasonable explanation for Chantal's disappearance. "She left," he said to his reflection in the darkened window, his voice as empty as his heart. "She left without a word, without an explanation, without even the courtesy of a goodbye, just like Serafina." But even as he spoke the words, even as he tried to convince himself that Chantal was no different from the woman who had destroyed him 30 years ago, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that he was wrong. Chantal wasn't Serafina. Chantal was an angel who had saved his soul, who had loved him when he was broken and bitter and convinced he was unworthy of love. The sound of the elevator chiming broke through his dark thoughts, and Micah turned to see Atticus stepping into the hallway, his face grave with the kind of expression that meant important news. "Sir," Atticus said carefully, "I've found her." Micah's heart stopped, his entire body going rigid with a mixture of hope and terror. "What?" "Miss Renee," Atticus said, pulling out his phone and showing Micah a series of photographs. "She's been in Trinidad this entire time. Her grandmother, she's been in a coma for the past 6 months. Miss Renee hasn't left her side." The photographs showed Chantal sitting beside a hospital bed, her hand holding that of an elderly woman who looked exactly like her. She was thinner than Micah remembered, her face drawn with exhaustion and grief. But her eyes still held the same love and determination that had first captured his heart. "She's been there the whole time," Micah whispered, his voice breaking as the full weight of his mistake crashed over him. "She wasn't running from me. She was staying with her grandmother." "Yes, sir," Atticus said gently. "I spoke with her friend Zinnia, who gave me the details. Miss Renee has been trying to reach you for months. She's called the office over 50 times, sent dozens of letters, even had her friend try to contact you. But you gave orders that you were not to be disturbed by anyone connected to her." Micah felt his knees buckle, the magnitude of his error stealing the breath from his lungs. He had been so consumed by his own pain, so blinded by his fear of being abandoned again, that he had abandoned the woman he loved most in the world when she needed him most. "I have to go to her," he said, his voice urgent with desperation. "I have to go to her right now." "Sir," Atticus said, "there's more. Mrs. Baptiste. She passed away yesterday." The words hit Micah like a physical blow, and he had to grip the edge of his desk to keep from falling. Chantal's grandmother, the woman who had raised her with such love and wisdom, who had taught her everything beautiful about life and love, was gone. And Chantal had been alone, had faced the loss of the most important person in her world without the support of the man who had promised to love her forever. "I have to go," Micah said again, his voice stronger now, filled with the kind of determination that had built his empire. "I have to go to her now." "I've already chartered a jet," Atticus said, his voice warm with approval. "It's waiting at the airport. But, sir, are you sure she'll want to see you? After 6 months of silence?" "I don't know," Micah admitted, his heart breaking at the thought that he might have lost her forever. "But I have to try. I have to at least try to explain, to apologize, to tell her that I never stopped loving her for a single moment." The flight to Trinidad was the longest 8 hours of Micah's life. He sat in the leather seat of his private jet, staring at the engagement ring he had carried in his pocket for 6 months, the ring that should have been on her finger, the ring that represented all the promises he had been too afraid to keep. When the plane landed in Port of Spain, Micah felt like he was walking into a dream. The Caribbean air was warm and humid, filled with the scent of tropical flowers and the sound of music floating on the breeze. Under different circumstances, he might have found it beautiful, but all he could think about was Chantal, alone and grieving, believing that the man who had promised to love her forever had abandoned her when she needed him most. The hospital was a small, simple building that spoke of dedicated care despite limited resources. Micah found himself in the elevator, his heart pounding as he rose to the third floor, where Atticus had told him he would find her. He saw her through the window of the hospital room, sitting beside an empty bed, her head bowed in grief. She was wearing a simple black dress, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, and she looked so fragile, so broken, that Micah felt his heart shatter all over again. He knocked softly on the door, his voice barely above a whisper. "Chantal?" She looked up, her eyes widening in shock as she saw him standing in the doorway. For a moment, neither of them moved, neither of them breathed, as they stared at each other across the space that had seemed impossible to bridge. "Micah," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying, "what are you doing here?" "I came to find you," he said, stepping into the room, his eyes never leaving hers. "I came to apologize, to explain, to tell you that I've been the biggest fool in the world." "You're 6 months too late," she said, her voice bitter with pain. "I called you every day for weeks. I wrote you letters. I had Zinnia try to reach you. I did everything I could to contact you, and you ignored me." "I know," Micah said, his voice breaking. "I know, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Chantal. I let my fear, my past, my own cowardice convince me that you had left me. I was so terrified of being abandoned again that I abandoned you instead." "She died alone," Chantal said, tears streaming down her face. "My grandmother died, and the man I loved, the man who had promised to be my partner, my forever, wasn't there. I needed you, Micah. I needed you more than I had ever needed anyone, and you weren't there." "I should have been," Micah said, crossing the room to kneel beside her chair. "I should have been here, should have been holding your hand, should have been helping you through this. I failed you in the most fundamental way possible." "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why did you shut me out? Why did you believe the worst of me?" "Because I was scared," Micah admitted, his voice raw with honesty. "Because 30 years ago another woman left me when things got difficult, and I never learned how to trust that love could be real. Because I was a coward who was more afraid of being hurt than I was committed to fighting for what we had." "I loved you," Chantal said, her voice breaking. "I loved you more than I had ever loved anyone, and you threw it away because you were afraid." "I still love you," Micah said desperately. "I never stopped loving you, not for a single moment. These past 6 months have been hell, Chantal. I've been dying without you, slowly suffocating in a world that feels empty and meaningless without your light." "It's too late," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction, and Micah saw something flicker in her eyes, a spark of the love that had once burned so brightly between them. "It's not too late," he said, reaching for her hands. "Love like ours doesn't die, Chantal. It gets buried, it gets wounded, but it doesn't die. We can heal this. We can find our way back to each other." "I don't know if I can trust you again," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can open my heart to someone who abandoned me when I needed them most." "Then let me prove it to you," Micah said, his voice fierce with determination. "Let me spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of your love, that I'll never leave you again, that I'll fight for us, no matter what comes." They stood together in the hospital room, surrounded by the aftermath of loss and the possibility of redemption. And as Micah pulled her into his arms, as she melted against him with a sob that sounded like relief, they both knew that this was their second chance, their opportunity to prove that love could survive even the darkest storms. "I missed you," she whispered against his chest. "I missed you so much I thought I would die from it." "I missed you too," he replied, his arms tightening around her. "I missed you more than I missed breathing." As they held each other in the quiet of the hospital room, both of them crying and healing and remembering what it felt like to be complete, Micah knew that this was just the beginning. They had found each other again, but now they had to learn how to trust, how to forgive, how to love without fear. But looking down at the woman in his arms, feeling her heart beating against his chest, he knew that they could do anything as long as they were together. The cold, ruthless businessman was melting again, and this time he was never going to let the frost return to his heart. Are you curious about what happened to Serafina, the woman who destroyed Micah's heart 30 years ago? Her story takes an unexpected turn in the final chapter that will surprise you and show the true power of love's triumph over hatred. Chapter 10. Forever begins today. True love stories don't end with the first kiss, or even the wedding vows. They reach their most beautiful crescendo when two people discover that the love they've built together is strong enough to transform not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone they touch. 2 years had passed since that magical day in the Trinidad hospital, when Micah and Chantel had found their way back to each other, and their love had only grown deeper, stronger, more beautiful with each passing moment. They had been married on a beach in Barbados, surrounded by the crystal-clear waters that reminded them both of new beginnings, with Cordelia's favorite gardenias woven into Chantel's hair and her grandmother's blessing carried in the Caribbean breeze. Now, on a crisp October morning in Central Park, they walked hand in hand through the falling leaves, their fingers intertwined, their hearts beating in perfect synchrony. Micah had changed in ways that still amazed him. The Ice King was truly gone, replaced by a man who had learned that vulnerability was not weakness, but the greatest strength of all. "I love this time of year," Chantel said, her voice soft with contentment as she watched a child chase pigeons across the path. "Everything is changing, but it's beautiful change, like our life together." "Everything is more beautiful when I see it through your eyes," Micah replied, bringing her hand to his lips for a gentle kiss. "You've taught me that change doesn't have to be something to fear. It can be something to celebrate." They had built a life together that was everything they had dreamed of and more. The community center that Chantel had always wanted was now a reality, a gleaming building in the heart of Manhattan that provided education, healthcare, and hope to families who needed it most. Micah had discovered that using his wealth to help others, guided by his wife's compassionate heart, brought him more satisfaction than any business deal ever could. "Mrs. Rodriguez's daughter got accepted to Columbia," Chantel said, her face glowing with pride. "She's going to be the first in her family to go to college. The scholarship program is changing lives, Micah." "Your heart is changing lives," he corrected, his voice warm with love. "I just provide the funding. You provide the magic." As they walked deeper into the park, past the playground where children laughed and played, past the pond where couples shared quiet moments, Micah felt the familiar surge of gratitude that had become his constant companion. He had been given a second chance at love, at life, at happiness, and he never took a single moment of it for granted. They were approaching the small cafe where they often stopped for coffee when Chantel suddenly stopped, her hand tightening on his arm. "Micah," she said, her voice filled with concern, "look." He followed her gaze to a bench near the fountain, where a woman sat hunched over, her clothes dirty and worn, her hand outstretched as passers-by hurried past without a second glance. She was begging, clearly homeless, her face gaunt with hunger and desperation. But it was a face that Micah recognized even after all these years. "Serafina," he breathed, his voice barely audible. Serafina Valdez, the woman who had been his first love, his first heartbreak, his first lesson in the cruelty of the world, was sitting on a park bench begging for change. The beautiful socialite who had once moved through Manhattan's elite circles like a queen was now reduced to asking strangers for spare coins. Is that? Chantal asked, her voice gentle and understanding. Yes, Micah said, his voice steady despite the shock. That's her. That's Serafina. For a moment they stood in silence, watching the woman who had once destroyed Micah's life, now destroying herself. She looked older than her years, her face etched with lines of hardship and regret, her once lustrous hair now grey and unkempt. What happened to her? Chantal asked, her heart already going out to the broken woman on the bench. Caspian Voss, Micah said, the pieces falling into place. The man she left me for. His empire collapsed about 5 years ago. Bad investments, federal investigation, bankruptcy. I heard he fled the country, but I never thought about what happened to her. She's been living on the streets all this time. It looks that way. Micah felt a strange mixture of emotions, not the vindication he might have expected, but a deep sadness for the waste of a life, for the choices that had led to this moment. We have to help her, Chantal said, her voice filled with the same compassion that had first captured his heart. Chantal, you don't understand, Micah said, his voice gentle but firm. This is the woman who destroyed my life. She's the reason I spent 30 years afraid to love, afraid to trust, afraid to hope. I understand exactly who she is, Chantal said, her dark eyes meeting his with steady resolve. But I also understand who you are now, and the man I married, the man I love, would never walk away from someone who's suffering, no matter what they did to him in the past. Micah stared at his wife, at this incredible woman who had not only saved his soul, but was now teaching him the true meaning of forgiveness. She was right, of course. The man he had become because of her love could not walk away from suffering, even when that suffering belonged to the person who had caused him so much pain. You're right, he said, his voice filled with wonder at her goodness. You're absolutely right. They approached the bench together, and Serafina looked up as they drew near. Recognition dawned in her eyes, followed immediately by shame and fear. Micah, she whispered, her voice hoarse from years of hard living. I'm sorry. I know you don't want to see me. Are you hungry? Chantal asked gently, crouching down to meet Serafina's eyes. When was the last time you had a proper meal? Serafina stared at her, confusion evident on her weathered face. Who are you? I'm Chantal, she said with a warm smile. I'm Micah's wife, and I think we need to get you something to eat. His wife? Serafina's eyes filled with tears. But I thought, after what I did to him. That was a long time ago, Micah said, his voice gentle but firm. People change, Serafina. People grow, people heal, people learn to forgive. I don't deserve your forgiveness, she said, her voice breaking. I destroyed your life. I was greedy and selfish and cruel, and I ruined everything beautiful we had together. You didn't ruin everything, Micah said, taking Chantal's hand. You hurt me, yes. You broke my heart and left me lost for 30 years, but that pain led me to become the man I needed to be, to love my wife the way she deserves to be loved. I don't understand, Serafina said, looking between them with confusion. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead us to the best things, Chantal explained, her voice warm with wisdom. Your choices hurt Micah, but they also prepared him to appreciate real love when he found it. In a strange way, you helped create the man I fell in love with. I was such a fool, Serafina said, tears streaming down her face. I had real love, and I threw it away for money and status. And where did it get me? Caspian left me the moment his fortune disappeared. I lost everything, my beauty, my youth, my home, my dignity, everything. You haven't lost everything, Chantal said gently. You still have your life, and that means you still have the chance to start over, to make different choices, to find some measure of peace. Why are you being kind to me? Serafina asked, her voice filled with bewilderment. I'm the woman who broke your husband's heart. Because, Chantal said, her voice steady and sure, kindness is the only thing that can heal the wounds of the past. Because everyone deserves compassion, especially when they're suffering. Because my grandmother taught me that the only way to defeat hatred is with love. Micah watched his wife in awe, seeing once again the incredible depth of her character, the boundless capacity for love that had transformed his life. This was why he had fallen in love with her, not just her beauty or her warmth, but her ability to see the humanity in everyone, even those who had caused pain. "Come on," he said, extending his hand to Serafina. "Let's get you cleaned up and fed. There's a shelter I know about, a good one. They'll help you get back on your feet." As they walked toward the cafe, Serafina between them, Micah felt a profound sense of closure. This wasn't about revenge or vindication. This was about the healing power of love, about the way forgiveness could transform not just the forgiven, but the forgiver. "Thank you," Serafina said quietly as they found a table in the warm cafe. "I don't know why you're helping me, but thank you." "We're helping you because it's the right thing to do," Micah said simply. "Because everyone deserves a second chance, and because love is always stronger than hate." They spent the next hour talking, sharing stories, healing old wounds. Serafina told them about her years of hardship, about how she had gradually lost everything she had thought mattered, about how she had learned too late that love was the only thing that truly counted. "I see the way you look at each other," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "You have what I threw away. You have real love, the kind that lasts, the kind that makes everything else worthwhile." "Yes," Micah said, his hand finding Chantal's across the table. "We do." As they prepared to leave, having arranged for Serafina to get help at a rehabilitation center that would provide her with housing, counseling, and job training, Chantal turned to Micah with a smile that could have lit up the world. "I have something to tell you," she said, her eyes sparkling with joy and love, and the most beautiful secret. "What is it?" Micah asked, his heart racing at the expression on her face. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "We're going to have a baby, Micah. A little girl." The words hit him like a physical blow, but this time it was a blow of pure joy. He pulled her into his arms, spinning her around as they both laughed and cried with happiness. "A baby," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "Our baby. Our daughter," Chantal corrected, her hands moving to her still flat belly. "She's going to be born into a world full of love, surrounded by parents who adore each other and will teach her that kindness is the greatest strength of all." As they held each other in the middle of Central Park, surrounded by the autumn leaves and the golden light of late afternoon, Micah felt his heart overflow with gratitude. He had been given everything he had never dared to dream of, a woman who loved him completely, a life filled with purpose and meaning, and now a child who would carry their love into the future. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "I love you beyond words, beyond reason, beyond anything I ever thought possible." "I love you too," she replied, her voice filled with the same wonder and joy. "And I can't wait to meet our daughter, to tell her about her father who learned that love is the only thing that matters, and her mother who learned that sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones that almost end before they begin." As they walked home together, hand in hand, hearts full of love and hope and the promise of tomorrow, Micah knew that this was not the end of their story. It was just the beginning. They had found each other in the darkness, had learned to love without fear, had discovered that true love could overcome any obstacle. And now they were going to create a new life, a little girl who would grow up knowing that love was the most powerful force in the universe, that kindness could heal any wound, that everyone deserved a second chance at happiness. The cold, calculating man he had once been was gone forever, melted away by the warmth of a love that would last for eternity. In his place was a man who had learned that the greatest victories were not won in boardrooms or through business deals, but in the quiet moments of connection between two people who had found their home in each other's hearts. And as the sun set over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Micah and Chantel walked toward their future together, carrying with them the knowledge that love, real, transformative, eternal love, was the only thing that truly mattered. Their love story was complete, but their life together was just beginning. The end.